So here's Paweł Pacana from Arkansas, Michał Omnicki from VMedia, and Tymon Tobolski. Yeah. And any one of you. Yeah. So, cloud or dedicated hosting, Paweł?
Okay, so my idea is that you might want to use dedicated hosting when you're focused on performance, because the dedicated hosting and the bare metal servers might provide you some performance benefits over cloud. But I'm not sure if I would recommend starting with dedicated servers, because it means you would have to worry about the hardware. What cloud is nice for is that it gives you an abstraction over hardware, so you don't have to worry about failed disks. You don't have to set up write arrays and that stuff. So it might require more work for you if you go into dedicated servers and it's sorted out already in the cloud, but you have some performance hits.
Okay, so in my opinion, I would always start with cloud. With dedicated servers, well, if you have a dedicated administrator who can manage this stuff, then okay, you can do that. But we are mostly developers, so we should focus on the development, not on the IT side of things. So for example, I used to hate Heroku. I thought that, well, I can set up everything myself. So why would I pay Heroku to do this stuff? But well, I had a lot of problems with that approach. So clients calling me directly that something isn't working at night. So since then, I decided it's like I want to make my life easy. I want to focus on development and on providing features. So that's why I prefer to let Heroku or any cloud manage the IT things of sites. So yeah, I would go with cloud.
Okay, so for me, the first thing to clarify here is that what does cloud really mean? Because we can go from just real machines standing in our basements or data centers through VPS, some cloudish machines with limited resources, up to completely managed environment like Heroku. So there's like a huge variety of what we can choose. And actually, I had a similar story. I used to hate Heroku for their pricing, lack of features, a lot of limits that you need to keep up with. But from my experience, it actually kind of makes sense. For example, I guess one of the worst features of Heroku is like the read-only file system, which for the beginning is a pain in the ass because you need to set up something remotely. But then when the app grows, it's kind of actually pays back. So we in the Montreal recently moved all the internal applications from DigitalOcean to Heroku. And for basically few reasons. Those apps started as very tiny, nobody is using that. But actually, it turns out that, yes, we are using those apps. And we got issues with, okay, there's no more memory on the server. We need to upgrade it. So how to do this? Yeah, weekend of downtime, because why not? And it's simply because when you start, you do not prepare for high scale or just put it there and just to run it. But then it's a little bit. It's easy to not notice the moment when we should take more care about the hosting. So right now we moved everything to Heroku, and when we get to the point that the app is just too slow, we can just in 5 minutes increase the resources, and that's the main point here for me.
Yeah, I would like to add something. So if, for example, Heroku is too expensive for you, there is an alternative. It's called Doku. And it's like Heroku written in 100 lines of Bash. So yeah, it's really easy. It turns out it uses Heroku build packs. So pretty much what you can deploy to Heroku, you can deploy to Doku as well. And so you can buy a cheap dedicated server. So for example, from Hetzner. So you have like very strong 16 core or something machine for $50, and you install Doku, and you can pretty much run like 20 staging servers, and the load is very, very small. Well, it depends on the application, of course, but like for $50, you can have an environment for all your staging servers and for small production applications. So yeah, I would recommend to give it a try.
And my comment to that would be that at some time your disk will fail and you'll have to learn the process of replacing it or requesting a replacement and replicating the disk.
Yeah, so that's the issue with Hetzner.
Yeah. So my recommendation would be also to start with something like Heroku that does almost everything for you. And if you're not comfortable with it because of the pricing, because of the lack of the features, you might want to, if you get into this situation that you lack something from this platform, just explore what's there. And you can move to the more optimized, maybe not more optimized, but you can start with Heroku and there's a path to dedicated servers, but it requires more and more maintenance and more work from you. So try not to complicate first.
Do we have a question about Docker itself, or not really? Because Doku is based on Docker, which uses this Git-like commit-based file system, which will break sometimes. So that's one thing. That's what we were running, actually, all those staging caps, and no more. And the other thing is that first thing is you need to still upgrade. You need to upgrade Doku, you need to upgrade the system, you need to upgrade the Ruby versions, you need to just upgrade the build packs and all of that. And the second thing, it works for apps, but not really for data storage, because it's like extremely easy to just drop your DB, because you just deleted the container or something like this. So
yeah,
it's fun.
There is a thing called backups. So you know, even if you
not really, not mentioned here. I don't see backups.
Okay, so let's move the next question. How does your deployment process look? What tools do you use? Mina, Capistrano, or something else?
Okay, so I can start maybe this time. So I like Git-based deploys, like Heroku does. Or if you don't want to use Heroku, you can still use Git deploy from Mislav. So the thing is, deployment is a really easy thing. So you just have to put the code on the server and restart some processes. So I don't find the need to use Capistrano for that if I already have a tool, Git, that does it for me. So yeah, basically, I like to just push the code to some branch, and I expect this code to be deployed through webhooks and all the stuff. So yeah, I would go with something based on Git.
Yep, I mean that's definitely a path. About the tools like Capistrano, there's, I don't know if you know about this, because this project is not really very actively maintained anymore, but it's called Mina. It's like Capistrano alternative that has some different concepts. Like, for example, it generates the whole bash script that's with all the possible cases, and then just upload it and run it. And for like those the simplest projects, it's like very, very easy to set up. It's even simpler than Capistrano. But again, there is a drawback. It doesn't support multiple servers out of the box. So again, like the similar story. If we start with two simple tools, then sorry, you're on your own.
Yeah, so if you're on a platform, that platform probably provides a deployment script or procedure, like on Engineer, you have a separate tool to perform deployments. But I would like to talk about different concepts. So let's say you're not on a platform and want to do a deployment. What does your deployment consist of? It's pushing a new code to this machine, but also it may require some kind of supporting services, like installing software that should be there, like the tool to convert from HTML to PDFs and all that libraries that your software would like to need. would like to use. So I think there's a DSL in Chef to allow deployments. So your deployment might look like a run of a Chef client on this machine. I think there are several solutions that incorporate not only pushing the code based on the Git commit or from GitHub, but also installing the software and configuring the supporting services on the machine.
Well, for me, those are separate concerns, like installing the software and making a deployment. And really, how often do you need to push a code and install something? It's for me, it's a very rare thing. So I don't like to connect those things. I actually used to use this Chef deploy cookbook, and it turned out to be terrible because deploys are very long, because Chef has to converge and it takes time. So yeah, I just prefer, to make my life easier and separate installation from actual deployment. Why do I need to wait for what? Okay, that's a good point, and I will talk about it later because there is a question related to that.
Okay, so next question. Ansible, Puppet, Chef, SaltStack, which one and why?
Okay, I may start with it. So I'm familiar with Chef. I know a little bit about those different tools. I consider them to be very similar. So if you're proficient in one of them, there's no reason to look for another. That's my summary of it. I think I know all the quirks of Chef by using it for years. So I wouldn't be that comfortable to switch to Ansible or anything else which has the same concept of executing some kind of cookbooks or whatever it is named in that solution. Playbooks, yeah.
Okay, from my experience, I've tried Puppet, didn't love it really. Tried Chef and got really shocked about some of the packages, and especially like those cookbooks where, if I remember correctly, it was about installing Ruby on Ubuntu. So in order for Passenger to know the Ruby, you need to write the Ruby version into some temporary file that was referenced somewhere else, and all this madness. And I'm pretty sure this cookbook worked for somebody, but it was just too specific. But it was like a few years ago, so this will probably this is probably not valid anymore. One of the tools that I got a little bit more experience with is the Ansible, which basically has all the same issues with weird packages that's just missing one configuration variable here or missing something there, especially with packages like, okay, here you have a config for, let's say, MySQL, and it kind of takes care of generating the MySQL config files, but then you need to kind of add something to that config file, and you can't because the file is generated and the author of the cookbook didn't put this variable in that. But the Ansible is a little bit verbose, but for me, one of the very, very good points is that the configuration files are the YAML files, so it is easy to generate them from something else. And we had a running kind of like proof of concept running on staging apps. Software that just took care of generating all the boilerplate for typical Rails apps into that YAML, and then that YAML was executed with Ansible. So in that matter, it's kind of like easy to hack around, but basically it's like the same concept. So.
Well, for me, the biggest benefit of those tools is documentation. So it's fine that it's cool that the documentation happens to be executable, but really, well, the problem those tools solve for me, like I know what's going on in the infrastructure. So from my point of view, it doesn't really matter what you choose. So like Pavel said, if you're familiar with Chef, go with Chef. I like Ansible because it's easy to learn, and I think it's much harder to understand Chef. with Ansible, easy things are easy and hard things are hard. And with Chef, everything is hard, I think. Yeah, but other than that, well, all those tools do the same thing, really. So they do three things, actually. So they have to install software through, say, apt-get, generate configs, and restart processes. That's it. So this is easy, and I feel like we overcomplicate our lives with using those tools. So I think 5 years ago, I would use rsync and a bash script, and it would be easier for everyone to understand the thing. So yeah, and the point is, those tools are really useful if you have a huge setup, like, I don't know, 50 servers or more. But usually you have a small Rails application with, let's say, 3 instances of Unicore or Puma and a background worker. And you're trying to make like it very enterprise with SaltStack or whatever. Well, again, I would use Heroku. And if I would have custom needs, then most probably I would use one of those tools. But yeah, my point is it doesn't really matter because all those tools do the same thing, and what they're doing under the hood is trivial.
I just have one question. Do you have Heroku stickers
Well, I don't work for Heroku.
or discount?
Yeah, so I'd like to add another tool to the plate. Basically, I mentioned them in my presentation as well, and I think all of them are general purpose software configuration management tools. And I think Nix and NixOS should belong to that stack as well. And the reason why I use Nix and NixOS over Chef, Puppet, or CF Engine is just because, first of all, it's a stateless approach. And it's fully model-driven and ensuring all kinds of things like reproducible deployments and things like that. Of course, there's a price attached to it. So, for example, what you can do with CF Engine or Puppet is you can take an existing machine, write a model, and use that to modify a machine's configuration. That's something you can do with Nix. I mean, with Nix, everything is model-driven. Everything should start with the model. It doesn't take the state of the previous machine's configuration into account. It always deploys from your specifications. And it does it in such a way that, for example, multiple versions can coexist. That is sometimes quite inconvenient because if you have existing servers already that have a configuration, you can change them. That means you have to capture everything in the expression language that Nix uses. And there are also some difficulties in getting some obscure packages and configuration files to work, but for the majority of packages it works fine. And if you're willing to deal with that, yeah, you get great benefits. So reproducible deployment is great because if you want to make a critical change, for example, that means deploy it in a test environment first, then deploy the same configuration in production. And you're quite sure that, yeah, if it used to work in the test environment, it works in production as well. So again, I don't want to say Nix is always the best solution because, yeah, there's a price attached to it. But for me, I think these properties are great, and that's why I use Nix and NixOS.
Yeah, I think that most of my problems with Chef come from the statefulness, and there is some state that we change on the destination machine. So that might also explain some interest in getting into Docker, because in this model you kind of prepare a new machine, you're on a path to immutable servers, or that way. It's difficult to live with that state with Chef for me, so I think that Nixos has an interesting approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like, this is the same with all these tools, that what Nixos does is just start from scratch every time. And this seems like a trivial approach, but I start to think it's really the only one that is sane, because with all the packages and complex config, it's relatively easy to install stuff, but to upgrade or to remove, this is getting really, really complex. Because most of the authors of the packages do not care, and they assume, they make like a lot of assumptions that this will be installed, and more importantly, that something is not installed. And then you get into conflicts. So nobody's fault, it's just...
So the next question is, building NPM and app alongside with Rails on server or store it in on S3?
Okay, so maybe I can start this time. For one of the clients, we actually do this. We have a continuous deployment pipeline, and we build our assets and deploy application code on a CI server. And we don't deploy assets on S3, but it's a very tempting idea to put assets there, because at this moment when you have assets separate from the application code, your application deployments, you can treat your application servers as stateless, because the only state comes from the database. You have some machine to store logs, and you don't have to serve the assets because they are served from S3 or any kind of storage. So I think that this is an interesting concept, because you take away the state from the application servers, and you don't have to think about replicating that state if you have more. If you want to add more to scale the application servers, you don't have to worry about some kind of file system and replicated file system to store and to serve those assets.
I don't think I understand the question, to be honest.
So the question is, if you build app with while deploy happens, or just put it on S3 and serve it from S3.
I don't know if whatever works for you, but so first of all, I wouldn't put it on S3, but I would use CloudFront most probably. But I don't know.
I mean, I will be talking about this for like the next hour. That it depends. And again, for simple stuff, you would probably, first of all, do not have NPM. Just have something inside the Rails pipeline. Forget about the rest of the world. If you have the separate JavaScript tools-based app, then it still can live on the same server. And one of the reasons to still keep it with the app is that it's harder to get. It's easier to make it synchronized with the backend and frontend with tools like Capistrano, which keeps at maximum, let's say, 5 most recent releases. You get the old files like automatically garbage collected, so you don't have to worry about this. Also, with S3, you will get into fun with file names and hashes, because the Rails assets pipeline generates the digest in a file name, which is then used to just bust all the caches with S3. And when you have this separate, you need to somehow manage to do this. Because if not, and if you use the CloudFront connected with S3 or whatever, you can't have the same file name anymore, or you will pay a fortune for CloudFront. I don't know how it expires or something like this. So, I mean, for me, it's like exponential growth of complexity, but I think I would check the performance as the only reason to actually consider that.
Yeah, I also have some difficulties with this question, but regarding NPM, that's actually an interesting thing, because NPM is also a package manager, for example, like Nix, and does things like dependency management. But the way NPM organizes dependencies isn't as strict as Nix handles them. So that means for me, using NPM is basically a pain in the ass. Luckily, we have some tools in the Nix project, for example, that take a package.json file from an NPM project and converts that into Nix expression so that you can use the Nix package manager instead of NPM. That's great. And regarding S3, so I think the question is related to storing deployment artifacts in an S3 bucket or something like that. That's actually something we've already been doing with Nix. So in Nix packages, we have our own serialization format. We can basically create archives from any package, not just NPM packages, but for everything, Java packages, Ruby packages, and C. And yeah, we can easily store them on any directory that can serve content through HTTP, including an S3 bucket. And for example, the NixOS distribution distributes its binaries with S3. And for us, it works quite well.
Okay, next question is background jobs and process management in general. How to monitor, how to restart, upstart, monit, something else.
I can start. So I'm using RUnit. So it's a very simple tool, like the startup script that you use to execute your Unicorn or Puma or whatever. It's written in Bash, but in fact it can be written in any language. So there is no DSL for doing that. You're just using Bash. So that's one benefit for me. And the other benefit is it automatically rotates logs, so you don't need to have log rotate or something like that. And yeah, that's it. So I like it's how simple it is, and the thing that logs are automatically rotated.
I tried once the systemd, that is like everything right now. And don't try this at home, basically. It's extremely complex to just start with. So from my experience, it's usually just standard upstart or whatever. And I guess the most important thing here is to use the tool, actually. Because we had some situations that there was tool, and for example, like unicorns were guarded by some monitoring tools, but for example, a Sidekick process wasn't, and this was just a human fault. So I mean, like the consistency in using that, most probably just putting it into deploy scripts for some declarative configurations that you just do not forget about it, is like the most important stuff. I mean, what tool you use is sometimes just a personal preference, I guess.
I have completely different experience with systemd. First of all, it's everywhere, so even Ubuntu that had Upstart will have systemd, so maybe you just have to learn the difference.
Probably.
I find the service file description and quite like the declarativeness of how you describe the service files, but there's no big difference whether you use Runit or Upstart or systemd. This tool should be responsible for executing your application, monitoring whether it dies and restarting on the event, and taking out the logs from standard output and just piping it into syslog or whatever your tool for storing and rotating logs is. So just use process managers because they do the job of rotating logs and monitoring process live for you. There are some differences in syntax, how you describe how your process should be started, restarted, and what are the circumstances under which it should be restarted. I've actually find that tools behind systemd they have quite good user experience and user interface.
I might give them a try. One thing that I remember, and I mean, I hope you do not do this, but I did once, is to do not copy configuration files that you do not understand onto your machines, because they will work for the first time and for the second time, and then after reboot they won't. And one of the examples was, I don't remember, some kind of upstart file, and it was running smoothly. You can start, stop the service, everything's fine. But there was a line that at the time I didn't care about, that was saying, start this process on system startup, but wait for the WLAN 0 interface to be up, which is basically a Wi-Fi, which we do not have on servers. So actually it just never started. And yeah, do not copy it without understanding.
I would add, if you want to avoid those problems, just don't use RUnit or systemd, just use Heroku-like software.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah, so I'm also using systemd, but yeah.
Damn it.
from my experience, I also don't think it's perfect, but it's better than the primitive sysv init, for example. So some of
I
the
should
things,
go home.
yeah, some of the things I use is, for example, socket activation. I think it's a great feature, but sometimes it also tends to fail for some mysterious reasons, and that's something I don't really like. What I also don't like is the logger. So if you, for example, run out of disk space, then suddenly your log database is corrupt and you need to fix it. And I've been doing that quite a few times, and that's annoying. But yeah, at the same time, I'm also pragmatic because systemd does have some features like using C groups for process control, and currently there is no other init tool on Linux implementing that as convenient as systemd does. So I'm a bit pragmatic in this. So it's not perfect, but it does offer some interesting features that I like.
I will have to give it a try then.
Don't.
Okay, next question. Do you have a rollback plan in case the deployment goes wrong? If yes, what's the plan like?
Hard question.
What's the next one?
Just answer it.
So yeah, that's one of the great properties of Nix. So it always stores all the variants alongside older versions. So that means, yeah, if something fails, the old versions are still there. Just flip back the symlink profiles, and and the rollback is done. However, there's a small detail that isn't covered. That's mutable states, such as databases. So, for example, if you update the contents of your database to something else and that breaks, that's something that Nix doesn't take care of. So you need to rely on external backup tools. But for anything like configuration files, packages, and other static parts of the system, yeah, it almost comes for free.
Well, I agree that the database is the biggest problem, really. So if you run some migrations, you can uninstall anything or transition to previous state, but still you have the problem with database. So you would have to clone the database, and if something fails, then take back the original database. Well, I will repeat my arguments in Heroku. You just have a button to roll back to previous commit or previous release. So yeah, you can do that with Heroku. They should pay me, by the way.
Okay, my addition to this discussion would be that Martin Fowler has a mission to document all technical terms and ideas in IT world, and unsurprisingly, he has quite a nice article about the thing called blue-green deployment. The idea behind the blue-green deployment is that you put a new instance of your application, a new box, new EC2 instance, new Docker machine, whatever, or just a new application server, and you have at one moment you have your old version of the application, the new one, and you start redirecting all the traffic to the new one. If it fails or you recognize there are some issues, you just switch back to the previous running instance. So that could be a rollback implemented, but on a different layer, not on a single box, but
yeah, exactly.
on a load balancer.
Yeah. Yeah, so yeah, I deal with such problems in a similar way, but that requires other tooling than Nix. That's basically yeah. I mean, Nix has a couple of responsibilities, but not that kind of responsibility. So yeah, it has to be done by using another solution.
And I also think that's one rule that this is actually implemented in most of deploying solutions, is to kind of like do the deployment as in some kind of isolation and postpone the most dangerous parts to the very end. Which basically, for example, with Capistrano, we're building, installing gems and all of that assets, whatever, in a separate build directory, and the only like dangerous for the customers, the only dangerous operation is to change the symlink and restart server. So then a lot of stuff is happening, but if any of those fails, just, okay, remove the directory and start again. So this kind of like reduces the need for rollback at all. I mean, not at all, but like to some point.
I think it's basically, it's good to avoid big deployments. Like I prefer to deploy several times a day. So it's easier to roll back from a small change than from a huge change that you had your code on staging for months, then you deploy it in production, and boom, and well, you have a problem then. But if you deploy very often, of course it doesn't resolve the problem, but it's a bit easier to roll back from this small change.
Or another idea might be to use feature toggles. So you deploy the code, but this code is not activated for the majority of the users on your platform. So you might want to enable it for a subgroup or enable it for a day. And if anything goes wrong, you can just switch to the old code path.
And of course, do backups before deployment, just in case.
Okay, next question. How often do you deploy to production? Would you like to be able to deploy several times a day if you can't already?
I might start because on Heroku we're doing that. So I actually never had the chance to have a project that could be deployed a few times a day, except deployed to local host, if you can call that. So we tend to have customers that have very tight release schedule that can't really be changed because of reasons. But usually this applies only to the production environment and some testing and whatever. But the simplest thing, what can you do with Heroku, by the way, is that you can just connect auto deployment from GitHub or from any Circle, for example, Circle, but any CI. And I guess it's like very easy step just to start it. And just so we have all this staging as much up to date as possible. And this actually makes the developers to write better self-contained commits, because when you just I will push this, no matter it doesn't work, then the staging is broken, then another person will come to you and hit you in the face that you just broke the staging, why you do this. So it will somehow make the commits and the whole workflow a little bit more careful, let's say.
Basically, I would make a distinction between front-end and back-end. So with front-end, usually there must be a human involved. Someone has to look if everything looks right. But with back-end, you can pretty much test everything. So I like the idea of if your tests pass and you have good test coverage, just let it go to production. So the question would be, do you even need a staging server? And I tried this approach with pushing with deploying directly to production. And I like the fact that I really have to care about my tests, because there is no staging server, no human involved, so I must rely on tests. And pretty much everyone who works with the application is very focused to provide good test coverage. And thanks to that, you can really deploy to production after every commit and deploy several times a day. Yeah.
What if you could attach to, not rely maybe on tests, but you do deployment, but when there are many errors in your error notification software, you roll back or you commit or you revert the commit you've just deployed with the previous version. Would it work?
Depends.
It depends, but it's an interesting idea not to block on your 30-minute test suite to deploy.
So do you mean so you first deploy and then run tests?
Seems risky.
Very.
And it's for some people it might seem risky to do continuous deployment. So that's a nice trick. I almost forgot how it is to deploy manually. So when you do the switch, you don't want to go back. So maybe this crazy idea of having confidence, because once you're used to push regular small commits and do small changes and to continue to deploy continuously, it doesn't seem like that crazy idea to let the deployment maybe deploy to the small part of your infrastructure for some subset of users and just look for metrics and decide whether to revert or not.
Yeah, so feature toggles work great with this approach because you can deploy the code but actually disable it or enable it only for a part of users. So it makes the whole process less risky. But again, for me, it's all about tests. So if you have a good test, I see no reason why would you like to avoid this approach.
Yeah, so we do continuous deployment of our backend infrastructure, and we actually do it quite like 5 times a day sometimes, or 10 times a day, and we can actually do that because of the Nix technology that we use. So to give some numbers about our production environment, so in my presentation I've shown that we sell apps, and each app connects to its own backend instance, and we have about 200 of them in production. And we have like between 6 and 11 production machines. It depends on how much system resources we need at a specific point in time. But again, because you can, for example, store packages alongside existing versions first before activating them, yeah, we can. I mean, the downtime we typically have is like 5 minutes if we want to update all 200 of them. We still try to restrict the impact of changes. So, for example, what we can do in our configuration files is we can, for example, configure a subset of these services to use a specific branch, things like that. Regarding testing, that's something we don't do well in our company. So we have been debugging things in production quite a lot. That's actually bad practice, but luckily, because we have a powerful deployment system, we invested a lot of time in it, we can actually deal with that in many cases quite well. Yet, I think having a proper test suite that you can run often before you deploy in production, I think that's quite important to have, and yeah, we're still working on improving that, but at least the deployment technology is not working against us.
One of the things I'd like to add to that is even with tests, with the best setup you can do to have continuous deployment, there'll still be cases where, for example, you add a new environment variable to the app. I mean, the app requires this new environment variable, and it is not set on some environment, and you do the automatic deployment, and then it just breaks. And if you did it good, there will be some fallback to some default value, and you won't notice that on the application start, but it will break when you actually try to access that. For example, I don't know, like Redis URL or something like this. So for most of the times, automatic deployment for me is like really cool and kind of like must have, but there are some drawbacks of that.
Well, it's very easy to solve the problem you're speaking about. So if you have
With Heroku.
Ruby, yeah, even with I don't know DigitalOcean or whatever. So when it comes to environment variables, there is something like hash.fetch, and it like raises an error if the variable is missing. So when your application starts, you just can assign your config variables to some constants and ensure everything is set. So I mean, it's easy to solve.
I mean, if you're using tools like NVIT or something like this, it will do it for you. But still, this is an error on production that you might not notice. I mean, you will probably notice, but like a little bit too late.
Okay, next question. Do you use separate staging server, and if so, does it duplicate database data from production?
Not really. We had some apps that had like production environment, pre-production environment, testing, QA, staging, and whatever mess there was. And usually on the staging, there was some just really dumb data, because the staging was for developers mostly. On some testing, QA, there were data prepared by external QAs, for example. And on pre-production, there was a scheduled dump of some subset of data from production. But it's really I don't see a lot of value in like duplicating the real data. Because I mean there is a value that you work on the same stuff, especially for debugging or yeah, just seeing how it looks on real data. But there are quite a lot of issues with that, especially in terms of who should have access to that, who can see what, and often you just can't see all the data on production. I mean, the developers shouldn't be able to see because it's classified or whatever. So not that simple, and I don't find very much value in that.
Okay, so with feature toggles, you basically can have staging on production. And from my experience, staging was also always a dumpster or lagging behind the production code. You didn't know what branches are deployed there, whether they are experimental or not, and you had to care about the data and copying data. And there comes the topic of anonymizing the data for the staging environment as well.
Okay, so I agree that feature toggles solve most of the problems, but I still see some value in having a staging server. Again, mostly when it comes to front end, because I don't know, if you make a redesign or something like that, you rather want to see the production data rather than some fake data. So yeah, I see some value. Again, with feature toggles, it's a kind of investment you have to make. So you know, I wouldn't say that you should always use feature toggles. It's rather, if it makes sense, if the investment is worth it, then okay, go with it. But if it's easier to just use staging server, then use staging server. So don't be dogmatic about that.
Yeah, just don't be dogmatic. If you invest in feature toggles, it would pay off, because then when you work on multilingual application and you have everything ready besides the translations, you might want to deploy to just the country that has the translations ready and let some people use your software and have this psychological closure that you've done this task, and you just wait for translations for different markets, and you can enable this feature for different markets when the translations arrive, but you decouple from this step, and it's really liberating as well.
So about this staging production thing, we have something like that. We don't use it a lot. We typically use it for big changes, changes that we expect that would break a lot of things. But we can actually quite conveniently move databases from a staging environment to a production environment. And that's not because of the Nix package manager, that's unsupported, but I've created an extension tool myself. It's very experimental. It works with snapshotting a database, writing a dump to disk and transferring them. For us it works because we have many backends, but the databases are typically small, so they're less than 1 gigabyte in size, so you can easily make a snapshot of that and transfer that. And so it's partially because of this tool, but also partially possible because we have small databases. But it depends on the architecture of your system, and we have an architecture that works well with that. But I don't think it will work for if you have a database of several terabytes in size. Yeah, then this approach would be infeasible.
One of the cool features of Heroku, it's like quite a recent feature, is the Heroku pipelines, which itself is nothing fancy. You just have like the development, staging, production applications wrapped in one page. But one of the cool things is that you can deploy to, for example, staging environment, test it, check it, and then with just click, it will make the production. I mean, it will replace production with staging in terms of the code base. So it will use production configuration, production database, and everything. But the deployment will take like a second, because it won't run the whole build pack again because it's already built. So just click and it's there. So that's quite cool. And I don't have Heroku stickers either.
Okay, how do you anonymize production data, emails, other sensitive data when copying from production to staging or development environment?
I did once, not copying from one database to another, but to preparing a dump for one of the developers from production data. And actually, I just wrote a tiny script using Rake or whatever, just to mangle the data. I mean, I could left. I left the user names, changed all the emails to @example.com domain, and then there was a blob of text that was confidential, and just replaced that with some lorem ipsum, and just something simple as like this.
Yeah, I used exactly the same approach. So just a custom script that dumps the database, restores it on another server, and then just replace emails, credit card details or something like that, and address and stuff. From my experience, there is not that much to anonymize, so it's an easy work. So I agree with Timon. Just use a custom script.
There are some games like Faker that can generate valid data so that you can replace the real production data with some kind of fake emails or fake addresses that look legitimate but are not real.
I guess like the emails is one of most important pieces, so you accidentally do not send people emails that you don't want, and also credit cards, which basically should not be in your database anyway. So.
I said credit card details, whatever that means, but not credit card number.
Okay.
Yeah, so to be honest, I never had to do something like that. So for me, it's, I can't really comment on that.
So I will add a tiny thing, because for over 2 years I worked in payment industry, and we were processing credit card payments. And in general, when dealing with credit card details, you have 3 strategies. One is truncation of data, second one is hashing, and the third one is using totally fake data on your testing or development environments. And you're not allowed to use the same data, and you need to use one of the strategy. And we used the fake data. We never we never copied any data from production to use it in testing or in development machine, because it was too risky for us. And yeah, that was our approach. Yeah. Okay. Next question. How to share configuration between Rails application and some external service in order to run E2E tests, for example? E2E, end-to-end? Yeah, end-to-end.
That's a hard one. I had a case not with end-to-end testing, but sharing some configuration between multiple apps and multiple environments. So imagine there's a system made of like 5 different Rails apps, and those apps talk to each other. And in theory, all you need is to know the URL of the remote system, but then you need to know some basic auth passwords, some auth keys, some tokens, and all of that. Multiply that by 5 applications by 4 stages, and you will miss 1 or 10 configuration variables every time. So this is basically a madness to manage. And I've tried some distributed configuration management systems, like, for example, the etcd or something like this from the guys behind CoreOS, which is basically a key value store that is distributed on various nodes, minimum of 3 with the Rust protocol, whatever. But one of the things that I was really concerned about is that we are using all those keys to be to kind of like protect the application and services from unauthorized access, and then I'm supposed to put those keys into a different system that also needs to be secured. So it's like kind of never-ending story, and it's like we can reduce the number of keys to like a single token for configuration system. But for me, it just kind of like feels wrong. So I didn't find a good approach to that yet.
So you have both endpoints you would be using Nix, then yeah, you can just exchange the corresponding configurations. But I can imagine that it's hard to convince somebody else that is already used to another deployment to use that. So, but if they would use Nix, both of them, yeah, just exchange the expression and you're done.
I'll try to dodge the bullet of this question because there was a mention of end-to-end tests. I would advise to invest more in monitoring. So not writing end-to-end tests to exercise the system, but to monitor the traffic that is going. On the example of payments, you might want to see if the rate of the transactions of the credit card payments, for example, has not dropped, and if it dropped, it might be a red flag for you. So if you had to write an end-to-end test to payments, you would probably use some kind of sandbox of the payment gateway. So you would kind of rely on how this sandbox server is close to the production server, and you will still have not that much confidence as looking into production traffic and trying to at least see if there's some kind of anomaly or having some automated system notifying you.
Well, I would ask a question. Why do you need to share some configurations between applications? Like, maybe I misunderstand the question, but for me, like I assume by applications you mean microservices or something like that. So, for example, with payments, I would expect that there is one microservice and all the credentials related to payments are there. And you shouldn't really share those, but I know maybe for S3 or something like that, you have to do that. So I think I would use Chef or Ansible or something like that and just duplicate the configuration. So yeah, but I've really never had such a need, so hard to say.
I mean, to answer the question why to share configuration, and I do agree that if you have some isolated functionality that needs some configuration, it should be in that service. But you need to somehow connect with those. So just in our case, for authentication purposes.
Regarding authentication, so I would rather consider with AWS, for example, VPC, or if you don't have AWS, then just install a VPN, and do that on the network level, and then you don't need the credentials.
If we could, yeah. I mean, for the new environment, I mean, the customer moved it to the private cloud. I don't know even where. Secured with VPN and all that, so basically none of us can access that anymore. But yeah, that's one of the solutions. Basically.
Okay, just a side note: if you don't want to add a question, just leave the document, because software is broken and we already hit the limit of people watching this document, so people can't add more questions right now. Yeah, so next question. How to manage config data and share it between environments, and as it is not committed to repo, it happens that some new variable is not propagated correctly.
I guess like we already
so
said it, but if you want to add something. Yeah.
You want to add something regarding that? Yes. Okay. Do you use auto-scaling?
No.
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 Nope. Next question.
Do you deploy to production on Fridays?
Yes.
Just a regular day.
Always.
Yes, but I try to avoid it. I had a couple of times in which something, it breaks, and then suddenly in the weekend you need to diagnose, and that's something you don't want to do. But if it's a very small change that I have lots of experience with it, yeah, then I still feel comfortable doing it.
If you have continuous deployment and you're already pushing small changes, there's no real risk, being it Friday or early Monday.
I mean, for us, usually the change that has to be deployed on Friday is some trivial front-end minor label, whatever, that somebody fixes, pushes to production, and then it just breaks, or you can't see anything. Because I mean, from my experience, it's always like the smaller the change, there's the biggest chance, the highest chance that it will break. So.
Okay, have you tried AWS OpsWorks? Any thoughts?
Could you repeat the question?
Have you tried AWS OpsWorks? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I heard about it, but I never used it, so...
So how does it work for the rest of us?
Yeah, I'm an expert.
I don't know. We had one app, but I wasn't involved in that.
I never used it.
Is there anyone who actually have some experience? Come here. Yeah.
Annalie here? So you can, if you want. Yeah, just sit. Just sit. Okay.
Yeah, so a few words about OpsWorks is that it's pretty awesome.
Do you have stickers?
You need to be very no, I'm not. I not don't work in Amazon. So OpsWorks is like it's a cloud. It's like Heroku, but you control everything, and you don't have any Heroku limitations. And you have to be very deeply religious and believe in Chef, like that. It's absolutely what you need. And how it works, like. Normally in Chef, you have all those ideas about environments, nodes described by node definitions, cookbooks, etc., 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 that basically let you spawn your application in seconds or minutes on whatever server. So OpsWorks utilizes that, and it lets you define layers, applications, and everything via web UI, and it works. Like it's like an additional business layer over Chef, and you can do funny stuff like, for example, I think Pinterest is doing that. They are spawning servers when different time zones wake up and people just start using their services. So they basically, OpsWorks lets you do it like measure load on servers and automatically spawn lots of them. And you absolutely forget about any entropy on the servers. Like everything is always defined in Chef. So imagine you need to boot 100 servers because, I don't know, US time zone just started using Pinterest, and you just do it like in matter of, let's say, if you are good, you like on the beginning, one converge of an instance like 15 minutes, but later you can optimize it and it's like 30 seconds to converge one and boot one machine. It's pretty awesome, and it's like, as I said, you need to be really like a deep Chef believer to use it. That's pretty that.
I don't
and it's
like...
based on EC2, of course. Yeah, it's like an additional layer over EC2.
Well, for me, it sounds like it's great if you have a huge setup, like Pinterest has.
Not necessarily. I was hosting an application, like a microservice application, that had 3 layers, one load balancer, micro instance. No, sorry, two instances with one Elastic AP. In one layer, on the other layer, we had like up to 3, between 1 and 3 Rails servers. It was a super small app, like B2B app. And there was only one PostgreSQL server. But the good thing about PostgreSQL server is that you can almost replace the hardware, upgrade the hardware almost online. You basically start the server that you want to replace. It waits for the what's the name? Does anyone remember what's the name for like this network drive on Amazon? I forgot. Yeah, so it wants to mount the EBS. You shut down the old server, but the new server, you like use the same configuration. It was isolated, but you just almost replace it. Like it's like 1 or 2 seconds. Like how can you do it in production anywhere? Tell me, other than on Heroku. Like upgrade don't care about your hardware anymore. Like it's not there. You can do the same with application servers because application servers don't host. Like if you store everything on S3, all the assets, all the mutable data, so to say, somewhere else. You don't care about how many servers are booted. You can replace them online. Nothing get lost because you have this additional layer with load balancer that automatically reroutes traffic to fall that like if something is failing on an application server, it's booting on, it's going down. It won't just receive the traffic, and everything there is automated. It's like I love it. Sorry, and I don't work for them.
Yeah, so my point is, okay, the load balancers and stuff and multiple layers, it's cool. But if you have, I know, one server, then why do you need a load balancer?
If you have one server, it's like just, Chef. That's all. This is what Amazon OpsWorks gives you. If you like Chef, if you don't want to spend hours on like setting up your whole Chef stack, it's just there. And creating a Rails application, like a vanilla Rails application, and deploying it on OpsWorks, it's a matter of like 10 minutes or something. You basically like literally do create app, URL to repo, enter, deploy.
So there's
That's
already
all.
a template.
And you have access, kind of, yeah. And like all Rails applications are kind of the same, I'm saying about like vanilla basic project, not like, when your Capistrano has like tens of lines or something like that. And it uses Chef for deployment. So you have a button to deploy on Chef OpsWorks. And it kind of always works. So that's really cool, yeah. And it has automatic rollbacks and all the stuff, like just for free. And the main difference between OpsWorks and Amazon and Heroku, for example, is that you actually have the access to the CLI. You can go there. Those are real servers. You can see the configuration. Of course, every time you change anything, it will just evaporate because it's provisioned from Chef.
Well, with Heroku, you have access to CLI as well. And also, if you want to build a custom container, you can provide your own build pack. So if you want, for example, custom Nginx configuration or something, you can do that. But you do it through build packs. And my point is, usually you don't need it.
Yeah, that's true. Unless you need.
Then you can do that.
Okay. How do you monitor application status? What do you use to check if your server or app is down?
Heroku.
Not really. I mean, by default, Heroku kind of like sucks with monitoring. If app is down, you can get this gray screen like this app is not up. So sorry. But anyway, I had only a little experience, mostly with tools like Pingdom, just does pinging. But the fun fact with those tools is that only few of them allow some more complex checks than just the response status. And if you do not have a special health endpoint, then you need to do some tricks, especially with apps that do not allow any non-authorized users to enter the app. So when hitting the home page, you get the redirect, and it seems fine. You put it in a check, and then it turns out that the redirect is actually wrong because it's what's supposed to redirect to the authentication provider, but because configuration is messed up, it redirects back or in a loop or whatever. So I did check a few of those basic monitoring tools, and there was one that I found, it's called like Status Cake or something like this, that allows you to grab the response basically. So you can do a little bit more checks if you do not have a special endpoint.
Yeah, so my experience is that you can use some hosted service like Pingdom, and there should be several of them. If you have a time and money to invest, you can go into Sensu, which is quite nice Nagios clone. You can host it in your infrastructure. Maybe someone already provides the hosting of it. So the idea is that you can write any kind of check, and you have a schedule how those checks, how frequently they should be performed, and how many occurrences of a failure state should be notified, and what are the channels of notifications, whether it should be on your pager, on email, or just a Slack channel. So I would, again, recommend starting with something simple like Pingdom, because it takes away all those complexity. You just enter the URL of your application that should be monitored. But when you have more sophisticated needs the Sensu is written in Ruby. It uses some Ruby components, and you can write plugin actually in any kind of language because it has a textual API for the check. So I found it really nice, the architecture of it and the extensibility.
I think it's a broader topic, really. So just checking if the server is down or not. It's like very basic thing. I think it's far more important to monitor, for example, in your application, you expect that 100 users will register every day. So I would add a check that ensures that in some range the number of signups is how I expect it to be. So if it suddenly decreases, so for example from 100 to 10, it means that something wrong happened. So that's far more important alarm for us. So maybe there is no exception from Airbreak or anything. The server is up. But you know, something have maybe you remove the sign up button or something.
Or you rely on a third party like the payment gateway that is not processing.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think that in our community, New Relic is one of the hosted services that became quite popular. So on New Relic, you can have custom metrics. So you can instrument the New Relic and tell that for every registered transaction in your backend, you send the metric, you send the tick, and it can be graphed and put on a graph on a New Relic. So besides some performance monitoring that New Relic provides, you can have also a custom metric, and you could actually see what's the rate of the, for example, payments, whether it dropped in the last hour or last 5 minutes. I'm not sure how about notifications, how you detect kind of anomalies, but once you start using metrics, I think you develop a sense what looks normal, or you recognize that spikes.
Yeah, and if you use DDD, then you already have the events. Andrzej was talking about it on Friday. So you can pretty much send every event to New Relic, and the events are like user registered, payment made, payment failed, and so on. So you send pretty much everything to New Relic, and that's how you can make really sophisticated checks thanks to DDD.
Yeah, so we use Datadog for monitoring, and that's actually a third-party service. It's, I think, quite expensive because you'd pay like $15 per machine per month, something like that. But yeah, we were basically too lazy to investigate other options. But I think it's a great service. It supports many kinds of dashboards. So it supports a general dashboard showing you things like CPU utilization, disk space usage, and so on. But it can also monitor things like MongoDB queries per second. It has all kinds of integration modules. And if you want to install them, the instructions are also quite straightforward, telling you how to do it. And a bonus option is in NixOS, in the configuration, you can easily enable Datadog with a parameter corresponding to your key, and then it works out of the box. So that's what we've basically been using. And you can also use, you can configure your alarms. So Datadog will store your data for several months. It has a query language allowing you to configure your own alarms. For example, if the disk space consumption is below 90% for 5 minutes or something like that, it should send an email or something like that. You can all configure that. So yeah, it costs a bit of money, but I think they offer a great service.
And about alerting, I really recommend you all for the critical application sites, whatever, and to give your phone number to the alerting system to send you an SMS. Because one day you will just turn off notifications from emails because they know you, and then you can miss a thing. And like for the most critical parts, this SMS day will cost you a few groszy, but it's worth it, really.
Okay, so we reached the end of this panel. So thank you for the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.